Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in A Philosophy of Theism by Borden Parker Bowne, published in 1902. We're going to take a look at a very powerful chapter, Chapter 5. It runs from 171 to 211, and it looks at God and God's relationship to the world. So it's a key practical look at Bowne's theology. His doctrine of theism will address in this chapter what are the practical implications of the attributes and how that all works out toward realization. So it's an important chapter. Pages 171 to 211. Let's begin with block 1. We're going to look at the real world order as the divine nature and God's cosmic relation. The divine attributes make up the ontological triad of, here's your attributes that we had in the previous lesson: unifying self-consciousness, passes through immanent omnipresence, and reaches eschatological omnipotence. I'll say that again because that is the triad from the previous lesson. That's the triad, the ontological triad that makes up the attributes of God for Bowne. He begins with unifying self-consciousness, God in himself. God goes out of himself in immanent omnipresence, and then God returns to himself in eschatological omnipotence. The world is a free act of creation by God. God is the infinite agent. The finite is produced by God. The finite is posited by the infinite. Now, in note 2, we're going to look at the forms of divine activity. And Bowne says all modes of existence are forms of the divine activity. They are all modes of his agency. Universal reason is the real, and finite mind exists in and through its manifestations. And Bowne says only selfhood, only finite selfhood can mark off the finite from the infinite. The system of existence is not a product of our own. It's a product of divine reason, the universal reason, which is the real, and our finite minds together. So then note 3 gives us the infinite system of experience. Creation means to posit something into existence that before did not exist. God caused a new existence to begin. The world still depends on divine activity. The infinite is forever actualizing its energia. Remember, the movement of spirit is from dunamis, potentiality, to energia, actuality. So the infinite is forever actualizing energia according to certain laws. The real world order is the divine nature. So we have our theoretical triad from the previous lesson. And if you look at the little inserted box I have inclusive in block 1, the theoretical attributes of God are unifying self-consciousness, going out in immanent omnipresence, and returning through eschatological omnipotence. But then we know from note 3 there that at the practical level, this becomes God moving from dunamis potentiality to energia actuality, from dunamis to energia. So now we need to take a look at the concrete reality of the world order in block 2. We know what the theoretical looks like. What does the concrete look like? And we begin with the thelesis, or the divine will. The real world order is a product of the divine will. This includes energia, maintaining of the state of experience. Divine will is as unbegun as God himself. The divine will is God's free self-determination. And the telos ideals of the divine will are also eternal. So the first practical concept is the concept of divine will. Now the second concept is energia, note 2, or divine realization. God is unconditioned by anything outside himself. With God, willing is identical with realization. Time is only the form of change. The cosmic process is therefore not in time, but the cosmic process produces the form of time. God is non-temporal and exists in absolute self-possession, absolute self-realization. So, the first concept, practical concept, for God's relationship to the world is the relationship of the divine will. Second is the energia of divine realization. Those two together create divine actuality as the pragmatia. So take a look at note 3. Creation was the beginning of time itself. The cosmic process is co-eternal with God. Bowne says temporal terms have meaning within the cosmic process, but are empty when applied to the absolute God. Temporal relations are the form of our representations of this systematic process, and he closes out by saying that we understand the creative act through the on our side as our participation in acquiring the eidos ideas, and then forming a system of eidos ideas, and then positing them through phronesis and praxis to reach realization. That becomes our participatory creative act. So, the previous lesson, which we have recapped in Block 1, gives us the theoretical attributes of the living God. And those are God in himself as unifying self-consciousness, going out of himself in immanent omnipresence, and returning to himself in eschatological omnipotence. At a practical level, this eschatological omnipotence unfolds as an abbreviation of 3 sub-concepts in Block 2. Theism, the eschatological omnipotence, begins with God's will, his will toward the fulfillment of kingdom, and then energia, the realization of that teleology, which will reach pragmatia actuality. It will become actual. It will become actual reality. So we have our theoretical, we have our practical. Theoretical is basically 3 categories, and the practical are 3 concepts. So you've got 3 concepts abbreviated under 3 categories. That reaches eschatology, or that reaches teleology in Block 3. So our third moment is teleology, defining the ethical teleology. We begin with motive. The motive of creation is love. God's motive to create was one of ethical love. Love is the essence of the divine nature. And then we must address the issue of God's current relation to creation. What about his ongoing divine will? So note 2, under current relation to creation, Bowne says there are 3 possible views. There's Theism, which says that God withdraws after creation and the world exists on its own. There's perpetual creation, which is really simply a reproduction, kind of a maintenance of ongoing reproduction. And conservation, which again is more of a just sustained reproduction, and the new is not really available. But if you take a look at note 2b, Bowne's position is one of the current relation of God to the world is one of divine governing, as the eschatological omnipotence. This is his view. And basically he says that against deism, the system of laws simply supplies the form through which the divine purpose realizes itself. The system of law is subject to the divine purpose. Against perpetual creation, he says that is simply incessant continuous reproduction. But Bowne says the realities of selfhood, the reality of self-control, lead us to posit some absolute experience. So the alternative view of divine governing is coupled with the notion of a teleology of the supreme good. So that takes us to note 3. The motive of love and the relation of divine governing brings about the world law of spirit. The world law of spirit. A law which is given for all personal activity. The world law of spirit enters into the moral realm. The theoretical attributes above and the practical energia above bring about an ethical teleology. And so he wraps up here in note 4 on the ethical teleology. The world must allow for new factors from within itself and new impulses from without itself. The new impulses are that which is posited into the interwoven web of objective law. The new impulses arrive from human volition, our positing, and from special divine volition. Divine impulses include God guiding history, raising up leaders, direction in public thought, making hearts receptive to the word, and answering prayer, which basically always addresses the finite inner life. So for Bowne, we have the final triad, inserted triad in block 3. The final triad is the theoretical category of immanent omnipresence. God is understood as being immanently omnipresent with our existence. And he is present as a movement of spirit from dunamis, potentiality, to energia, realization. That's the second moment. And that brings about the notion that we live under the divine governing spirit. We participate in the divine governing spirit. So that's your final triad of the entire relationship of God to the world. But you'll notice that the first two moments, that immanent omnipresence, that takes up block 1, and the energia realization, that takes up block 2. And the finer points in those areas, basically block 1, that inserted triad, is the summary of chapter 4, the attributes of God. The attributes are a God who in himself is the unifying self-consciousness, who goes out of himself in love as immanent omnipresence in order to raise up creation in an eschatological omnipotence of reunion with God. Now, how does this raising up of creation take place? It takes place in block 2 through the thelesis will of God and through that movement from dunamis to energia of God's Spirit and the pragmatia actuality of divine purpose, the pragmatia actuality coming into realization. So both of those upper triads feed the final triad in block 3. And the critical one is simply this. Theoretically, we know God as immanent omnipresence. That's our metaphysical conclusion. Our ethical conclusion is that God is present as energia realization, as the movement of spirit from dunamis potentiality to energia actuality on the moral plane. So that's our moral conclusion. So our metaphysical conclusion and our ethical conclusion bring about the notion of God as divine governing spirit. And that's the summary point of all of chapter 5. So you get your 3 moments, but I gave you 3 inserted triads in each of those 3 moments. But your recall triad will be block 3, the inserted triad. Our recall triad will be immanent omnipresence, energia realization, and divine governing spirit. And that's going to wrap up chapter 5, pages 171 to 211. We made it into the 200s now. We're going to pick up next lesson on chapter 6.